Bennett Hale carried only a slightly wrinkled resume, an old jacket, and a quiet promise to be home before dinner. Inside the polished recruiting hall of Ashcroft and Vale Talent Group, Dorian Ashcroft looked at him like he was something the cleaning crew had missed. He mocked the gap in a single father's work history, then tore Bennett's resume in half in front of everyone watching. The room laughed along with him. Nobody in that hall understood that the torn paper was never a plea for a job. It was the final test of a decision already made. And the company they were all desperate to win as a client belonged, quietly and completely, to Bennett. If stories where arrogant people get exactly what they deserve keep you hooked until the very last twist, hit subscribe on this channel so the next reversal lands in your feed the moment it drops. The headquarters of Ashcroft and Vale Talent Group rose 30 stories above downtown Chicago, all glass and polished stone, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel smaller with every step toward the elevators. On this particular morning, the firm had scheduled a special recruiting showcase, a curated parade of candidates meant to prove something to a client they desperately wanted to keep. That client was Crownwell Systems, a logistics and artificial intelligence company in the middle of the largest hiring expansion the industry had seen in years, and everyone inside Ashcroft and Vale knew that landing the contract could define the firm's next decade. Junior recruiters had been told to dress sharper than usual. Senior partners had rehearsed their talking points. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and nervous ambition, and every employee moved like they were being watched, because in a sense, they were. Bennett Hale walked through the revolving doors a little after 9 in the morning, dressed plainly in a jacket that had seen better winters and shoes that had clearly logged real miles. He did not carry himself like a man chasing a job offer. He moved with the quiet, unhurried patience of someone who had already survived worse rooms than this one, though nobody around him could have guessed that. A brief text from his teenage daughter, Nora, lit up his phone screen, asking if he would make it home in time for dinner. Bennett typed back 4 words, telling her he would try, then slipped the phone into his pocket and joined the line of candidates waiting near the reception desk. The recruiters behind the counter exchanged glances as they scanned his paperwork. His resume showed a long, unexplained gap in employment, the kind of blank stretch that human resources departments were trained to treat as a warning sign rather than a story worth hearing. A few of the staff assumed he was a man trying to claw his way back into a workforce that had left him behind, and their assumptions showed plainly on their faces. Bennett offered no explanation and asked for none in return. He simply waited his turn near the back wall, arms folded, eyes moving slowly across the room, studying not the furniture or the artwork, but the way people here treated anyone who looked like they had less power than they did. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly why he had come. Other candidates in the waiting area glanced at him with the same quiet suspicion the staff had shown, sizing up his jacket, his shoes, the plain folder tucked under his arm, and deciding within seconds that he did not belong among them. A younger man in an expensive suit shifted his chair slightly away, as if proximity to Bennett might somehow lower his own chances. A woman nearby whispered something to her neighbor and glanced in Bennett's direction, and though he could not hear the words, the tone told him everything he needed to know. None of it seemed to bother him. He had spent years building something far larger than that room could imagine, and the opinions of strangers waiting nervously for their own turn meant very little against that backdrop. He thought briefly of the early mornings that had brought him here, long before Crownwell Systems existed in any recognizable form, back when it was little more than a handful of ideas scratched into a notebook at a kitchen table after his daughter had gone to sleep. He remembered the year he had spent learning to braid hair badly, the year he had missed 2 board calls because a school play ran long. and the year a business partner had quietly doubted whether a grieving widower could still function as a serious executive. Those years had taught him more about people than any recruiting seminar ever could, and it was that exact education he intended to test inside this building today. Watching the staff behind the desk whisper and exchange glances only confirmed what he already suspected about the culture Ashcroft and Vale had built for itself. Near the private elevator at the far end of the lobby, the doors slid open, and Dorian Ashcroft stepped out like a man arriving at his own coronation. He caught sight of Bennett standing near the wall, and something in his expression shifted into open contempt, the practiced sneer of a person who had never once had to prove his worth to anybody. Dorian Ashcroft had been introduced to that lobby many times as the crown prince of high-end recruiting, and he wore the title the way other men wore expensive watches, visibly and without a shred of humility. His suit alone likely cost more than most of the candidates in that room earned in a month, and his tone carried the particular arrogance of someone who believed wealth was proof of superior judgment. He was there that morning to impress his father, because Ashcroft and Vale needed to secure a recruiting contract worth tens of millions of dollars from Crownwell Systems, and Dorian had convinced himself that a flawless public performance would be his ticket to real authority within the firm. Spotting Bennett standing quietly near the intake line, Dorian could not resist an opening jab, asking loudly whether the man was there to apply for a security position or perhaps something in janitorial services. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the nearby staff, the kind of laughter people offer when they are afraid of becoming the next target themselves. Bennett answered calmly that he had a scheduled appointment, offering no anger, no defensiveness, nothing for Dorian to grab onto and twist further. Undeterred, Dorian snatched the resume from a nearby recruiter's hand and skimmed the first few lines, his eyes catching quickly on the unexplained gap left behind after Bennett's wife had passed away years earlier. Dorian did not know the reason behind that gap, and he did not bother to ask. Instead, he turned it into a punchline, announcing to the room that men who spent their years changing diapers and attending school conferences rarely had what it took to survive in a real corporate environment. Bennett did not respond to the insult directly. He simply held Dorian's gaze without flinching, and that stillness seemed to unsettle Dorian more than any argument could have, as though silence itself was an act of defiance he had not anticipated. Determined to reassert control in front of an audience that included several of his father's senior partners, Dorian tore the resume cleanly in half, then in half again, letting the pieces drift down onto the marble floor. He told Bennett that the scattered paper on the ground represented his future at the firm, and for a moment nobody in the lobby said a word. A few staff members chuckled softly, the kind of laughter offered purely to stay in Dorian's good graces, rather than because anything about the moment was genuinely funny. Only one person moved. A young recruiter named Paige Whitaker knelt down and quietly gathered the torn pieces from the floor, offering a hushed apology that nobody else seemed willing to voice out loud. Bennett told her there was nothing to apologize for, adding softly that sometimes a torn piece of paper reveals far more about a place than a perfectly completed interview ever could. Bennett left the lobby soon after, but he did not go far. He crossed the street to a small coffee shop with a clear view of the Ashcroft and Vale building, where a woman named Madeline Kingsley was already waiting for him at a corner table, 2 cups of black coffee sitting untouched between them. This was the moment the story quietly turned on its axis. Bennett had never been a job seeker inside that building at all. He was, through a private holding company called Hale Meridian, the true owner of Crownwell Systems, the very client that Ashcroft and Vale had spent months courting with polished decks and rehearsed promises. He had chosen to walk through their doors disguised as an ordinary applicant for a simple reason. wanting to see with his own eyes how the firm treated people who held no power and carried no impressive title. Crownwell Systems was preparing a nationwide expansion that would require thousands of new hires across engineering, operations, finance, and customer support roles. And choosing the wrong recruiting partner could quietly poison the culture of the entire company for years to come. Madeline, who served as the public-facing chief executive of Crownwell, while Bennett remained deliberately out of the spotlight, wanted to cancel the partnership on the spot after hearing what had happened in that lobby. Bennett asked her to wait, explaining that a single act of cruelty from one arrogant man did not yet prove the whole organization was rotten to its core, and that he wanted to see how leadership responded once the truth came out. Elsewhere inside the building, Paige had already sent an internal message describing what Dorian had done, flagging the incident to her supervisor with careful, professional language. The message sat unanswered in an inbox for hours, quietly ignored by people who had learned it was safer not to challenge the boss's son. That small, buried detail mattered more than anyone in that moment realized, because it proved something Bennett would later confirm for himself, that decent people still existed inside Ashcroft and Vale, even if the culture around them had been built to reward arrogance and silence conscience. Before leaving the coffee shop, Bennett asked Madeline and Sterling Bancroft, Crownwell's lead counsel, to arrange one final meeting with Ashcroft and Vale for the following morning, a meeting neither Dorian nor his father would see coming. High above the city, inside a glass-walled conference room on the top floor, Reginald Ashcroft gathered his son and several senior partners for an urgent strategy session. The firm had quietly been bleeding clients after a string of hiring bias complaints that had never reached the press, and the Crownwell contract represented far more than revenue. It represented a chance to rebuild a reputation that was cracking beneath the surface. Reginald reminded Dorian in blunt terms that he needed to behave with absolute precision in front of Crownwell's representatives, warning that one misstep could unravel months of careful positioning. Dorian, brimming with false confidence, assured his father that he had already cleaned out the weaker candidates from the pipeline to make the firm look sharper and more professional for the client. What he did not mention, because he did not yet know it, was that one of the candidates he had humiliated that morning happened to be the actual owner of the company they were trying to impress. He went further, boasting to the room about tearing up a resume as though it were an amusing anecdote rather than a warning sign, and several directors laughed along dutifully, eager to stay in his favor. Paige stood just outside the glass wall during part of that conversation, close enough to hear the tone if not every word, and something in her chest tightened with a familiar, helpless frustration. She believed Bennett deserved far better than what he had received, but as a junior recruiter, she had learned that speaking up rarely changed anything inside that building. The irony of the moment pressed heavier with every passing minute. The very people congratulating themselves for filtering out unworthy applicants were, without realizing it, filtering themselves out of the biggest opportunity of their careers. Just as the meeting wound down, an assistant knocked and announced that the delegation from Crownwell Systems had arrived downstairs and was already on its way up. Reginald straightened his tie, glanced around the room at his team, and told them firmly that today, of all days, there was no room left for a single mistake. The Crownwell delegation was shown into an elegant glass conference room on the executive floor, where Reginald, Dorian, and a row of senior directors waited with folders full of polished statistics and carefully rehearsed promises about fairness and inclusion in hiring. They had built an entire presentation around the phrase "putting people first," unaware of how sharply that phrase was about to be tested. Madeline Kingsley entered first, composed and unreadable, followed closely by Sterling Bancroft carrying a slim leather folder. Everyone rose from their seats out of habit and courtesy, and Dorian offered his most charming smile, a striking contrast to the contempt he had shown just one day earlier in the lobby downstairs. Then Bennett Hale walked through the door. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Dorian recognized him within seconds, and though he fought to keep his expression neutral, the color drained visibly from his face. He assumed, in a brief flash of relief, that Bennett must simply be a witness Madeline had brought along to make a point, and he quickly offered a smooth apology, describing what happened the day before as a small misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. Reginald glanced toward his son with a flicker of unease, sensing something was deeply wrong even before he understood what it was. Madeline did not take the seat traditionally reserved for the lead executive at the head of the table. Instead, she pulled out a chair for Bennett and gestured for him to sit there himself. Sterling placed a folder directly in front of Bennett, its cover printed with a single clear line identifying it as an ownership review concerning the Crownwell Systems hiring partnership. The first true twist of the story landed in that instant, quiet but seismic. Bennett Hale was not a job applicant who had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. He was the man with the final authority to decide whether Ashcroft and Vale would ever be allowed to work with Crownwell Systems at all. He did not raise his voice or lean forward for dramatic effect. He simply reached into his jacket, set the torn fragments of his own resume gently on the polished table. Fragments Page had carefully saved, and asked the room a single pointed question, wanting to know whether tearing apart a person's history before reading it through was standard practice here, or whether he alone had been given that particular treatment. Dorian attempted a nervous laugh, insisting the whole incident had simply been a stress test designed to see how candidates handled pressure in a demanding environment. He argued that in high-level recruiting, applicants needed to prove they could withstand a harsh atmosphere before being trusted with real responsibility. Bennett asked him plainly whether mocking a single father and shredding his paperwork in front of a crowded lobby counted as a professional standard at his firm, or whether it was simply cruelty dressed up in corporate language. Dorian's composure began to crack further as he fumbled for justification, pointing out that Bennett's clothing had not matched the room, that his resume contained an unexplained gap, and that he had arrived without any prominent reference to vouch for him. Bennett replied evenly that those exact details were precisely why every candidate deserved a fair, honest interview rather than instant judgment based on appearance alone. Sterling then unsealed a second folder, revealing footage retrieved from the lobby's security cameras, along with written statements gathered from several staff members who had witnessed the incident firsthand. This was not theatrical showmanship for its own sake. Ashcroft and Vale had agreed weeks earlier, as part of the vetting process, to allow Crownwell full access to review their hiring culture before any contract was finalized, which meant Dorian's behavior fell squarely within the scope of that formal evaluation. Reginald's jaw tightened with visible anger, yet he had no real argument to offer in his son's defense. For years he had taught Dorian that candidates were simply products to be filtered, while clients alone deserved genuine respect, and in this moment he began to understand, with a sinking feeling, how deeply that philosophy had corroded the company bearing his family name. The second sharp twist arrived when Bennett explained that the torn resume was never merely a personal grievance to be smoothed over with an apology. It stood as direct proof that Ashcroft and Vale was not currently equipped to build hiring practices for a company trying to establish a culture rooted in genuine respect. Dorian's eyes drifted toward Page, standing quietly near the back wall, and something in his expression suggested he suspected she might have been the one who reported the incident internally. Before he could say a word in her direction, Bennett cut him off with a calm, level tone, stating plainly that the only person responsible for damaging the room's integrity was the man who had torn the paper apart in the first place. With the room still absorbing that blow, Bennett offered a quiet explanation for the gap that had drawn so much ridicule the day before. After his wife passed away, he had stepped back from public-facing leadership entirely, choosing instead to raise his daughter while building Crownwell systems carefully from behind the scenes. He had no interest in exposing his family to relentless press coverage, and no desire to turn his private grief into a corporate talking point for anyone to exploit. For years, his real office had been a modest kitchen table, a rotating collection of hourly conference rooms, red-eye flights taken alone, and late-night calls placed only after his daughter had finally fallen asleep down the hall. He was not sharing these details to invite sympathy from anyone seated at that table. He shared them to make a simple point clear beyond argument, that a gap in someone's professional history is not automatically proof of failure. Sometimes it is simply evidence of a person surviving, rebuilding, and carrying more weight than anyone around them ever bothered to notice. Bennett continued, describing how the earliest version of Crownwell systems had been built almost entirely at night, after his daughter had fallen asleep, using a second-hand laptop balanced on a kitchen counter that still bore the scratches of a childhood spent doing homework at that very spot. He had taught himself to run investor calls between school drop-offs, learned to read supply chain contracts while sitting in pediatrician waiting rooms, and negotiated one of the company's earliest partnerships from a parking lot outside his daughter's dance recital, because there had been nowhere quieter to take the call. None of that had ever appeared on paper, because none of it fit neatly into the boxes a standard resume expected a person to fill. He was not describing these years because he wanted pity from anyone seated at that table. He wanted the room to understand that the gap they had mocked so easily represented some of the hardest and most disciplined work of his entire life. Madeline added that some of Crownwell's most valuable employees carried similarly imperfect histories, including people who once left careers behind to care for aging parents, workers who had weathered bankruptcy, and skilled engineers who had spent years doing physical labor long before they ever touched a line of code. One of the company's top logistics analysts had spent 3 years driving a delivery truck after an earlier employer folded during a recession, and it was precisely that ground-level experience that made her forecasting models more accurate than anyone else's on the team. Another senior engineer had dropped out of college twice before finally finishing a degree in his 30s, and his unconventional path had taught him to solve problems that formally trained colleagues often overlooked entirely. Madeline explained that Crownwell had learned, sometimes the hard way, that a spotless resume rarely predicted real ability, and that some of the sharpest minds in the company had histories that would have been discarded instantly by a firm like Ashcroft and Vail. The deeper meaning of this moment settled over the room slowly. Bennett was not simply asserting power through wealth or ownership. He was asserting a set of values he intended to build his company around, a workplace where people were judged by what they could actually do, rather than how polished they happened to look on a given morning. He turned to face Dorian directly, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm, telling him that tearing up his resume because he assumed it held no value was precisely the reason he could never be trusted to judge anyone else's worth again. Sterling then walked the room through a far more troubling pattern uncovered during the review, information that went well beyond the events of the previous morning. Crownwell's investigation had extended into years of Ashcroft and Vail's hiring records, revealing a long list of qualified candidates quietly filtered out for reasons that never appeared in any official paperwork. Age had counted against people. Family responsibilities had counted against them. Physical appearance, the prestige of a candidate's college, and the absence of powerful personal connections had all silently determined who advanced and who was discarded without explanation. Page had submitted multiple internal reports flagging exactly this pattern over the previous year, each one quietly buried without response or consequence. One especially skilled engineering candidate had been rejected simply because, in Dorian's private notes, he did not look the part of someone fit for an executive track. A single mother applying for a director-level role had been passed over because reviewers assumed, without asking her directly, that family obligations would limit her availability. A former military veteran with exceptional operational experience had been ranked lower than less qualified applicants purely because he lacked a graduate business degree. Reginald tried weakly to frame these choices as isolated errors made by individual staff members acting on their own judgment, but Sterling produced internal emails proving that Dorian himself had personally directed the creation of a so-called premium image candidate list. This was not an accident or a scattering of unrelated mistakes. It was a deliberate, systemic culture, built and reinforced from the top down over a long stretch of time. Sterling read aloud from one particularly damning internal memo, in which Dorian had instructed his team to prioritize what he called polish and pedigree over raw technical scores, effectively telling recruiters to rank appearance and background above actual competence whenever the two came into conflict. Another document showed that a promising candidate for a supply chain role had been quietly moved to the bottom of the list, after an interviewer noted, almost in passing, that he spoke with a regional accent that might not play well with certain executive clients. A finance applicant with 2 decades of experience had been rejected in favor of a far less qualified candidate simply because the younger applicant's father was a known name on the city's charity circuit. None of these decisions had ever been written down as official policy, which was precisely what made the pattern so difficult to challenge from the inside. Page explained, when Sterling asked her directly, that junior recruiters quickly learned which kinds of candidates would earn approval from senior leadership and which kinds would draw irritated questions in review meetings, and that lesson shaped behavior far more powerfully than any written guideline ever could. She had watched capable people get quietly filtered out for reasons no one would ever say aloud in a hiring committee, and she had watched herself grow more cautious over time, worried that pushing back too hard would cost her the very job she was trying to protect. Hearing his own daughter's experience echoed in a stranger's account of the same building might have moved Reginald once, but in this moment it only deepened the weight already pressing down on his shoulders. The third major twist of the story landed with quiet, devastating clarity. Crownwell had already prepared an ambitious plan well before that morning's meeting began. If Ashcroft and Vale could demonstrate genuine, verifiable change, they stood to win a hiring partnership spanning 12 states, a contract that would have transformed the firm's future entirely. If they failed this test, Crownwell intended to build its own internal recruiting division from scratch and quietly invite the honest, capable employees of Ashcroft and Vale to join that new team directly, leaving the firm's leadership to answer for what remained behind. Page felt her breath catch when Bennett mentioned that her name had already been included on Crownwell's shortlist of potential hires, a fact she had never anticipated and could barely process in the moment. The woman Dorian had always treated as insignificant and easily replaceable was, in the eyes of the man he had mocked without mercy, someone whose quiet courage had genuinely mattered. The confrontation between Dorian and his father reached its emotional breaking point soon after. Dorian, no longer able to maintain even the appearance of composure, argued that Bennett was blowing a minor incident wildly out of proportion, insisting that in the world of real business, people who could not handle harsh treatment had no business demanding respect from anyone above them. Bennett did not raise his voice in response. He simply turned to Reginald and asked him directly whether this was truly the person he intended to place in charge of selecting thousands of human beings for meaningful work. The question landed like a blade, striking straight at the heart of Reginald's pride and his legacy. Reginald understood, with sudden and painful clarity, that continuing to shield his son would cost the firm its most important contract, its remaining credibility, and very likely its best remaining employees as well. Yet, removing Dorian from the process meant publicly acknowledging that his own approach to raising and mentoring his son had shaped an heir who was fundamentally unfit for the responsibility he had been groomed for since childhood. He thought, briefly and painfully, of every lesson he had drilled into Dorian since boyhood, the countless dinners where he had explained that strength meant never apologizing, that hesitation was a weakness the Ashcroft name could not afford, and that the people on the other side of a negotiating table existed to be managed rather than understood. He had built his son in his own image without ever stopping to ask whether that image was one worth repeating, and the answer arriving in front of him now felt impossible to unhear. Sensing the ground shifting beneath him, Dorian tried a different approach, softening his tone and appealing directly to the years the two of them had spent building the firm together. He reminded his father of the long nights they had once spent poring over spreadsheets in the early days of the company, the sacrifices Reginald himself had made to build something lasting, and he argued that no single incident, however embarrassing, should be allowed to undo everything they had worked toward as a family. For a brief moment, something in Reginald's expression seemed to waver, the pull of loyalty and memory tugging hard against the plain evidence sitting on the table in front of him. Then Dorian made his final and most costly mistake, letting frustration override whatever discipline he had left, and asked his father with open disbelief whether he truly intended to let a single father in a worn-out jacket lecture the Ashcroft family on how to run a business. That single sentence proved to be the mistake that sealed everything. Bennett rose from his chair without raising his voice, his tone level, and unhurried as he corrected the record for the entire room to hear. He was not there to lecture the Ashcroft family on how to run their business. He was there simply to decide who would be permitted to conduct business with the company that bore his name. The fourth and most decisive twist followed almost immediately, as Reginald, visibly shaken but resolute, announced that Dorian would be suspended from all further involvement in the Crownwell partnership, effective immediately. He stated plainly, in front of his senior staff, that his son would no longer represent Ashcroft and Vale in any negotiation going forward. Dorian had torn Bennett's resume apart the previous day to prove, in his own mind, that the man did not belong anywhere near that building. Now it was Dorian himself being removed from the very room where his family's future was being decided, stripped of authority in front of the people who had once laughed along with his cruelty. Many in that conference room quietly assumed Bennett would simply stand up, gather his things, and walk away, leaving Ashcroft and Vale to collapse under the weight of its own failures. He chose a different path instead. He stated calmly that the true problem facing the firm was never limited to Dorian alone. It was an entire system that had learned to reward arrogance while punishing basic human decency, and that deeper rot needed to be addressed directly rather than simply cut away at the surface. Bennett then laid out a proposal that was firm but genuinely fair, explaining that Crownwell Systems would not sign any contract with Ashcroft and Vale under its current leadership structure. However, Crownwell was prepared to acquire the honest core of the firm's recruiting division outright, absorbing the staff members who had been silenced, sidelined, or quietly dismissed simply for caring too much about doing the job with integrity. This offer captured the deeper meaning of the entire story with striking precision. Ashcroft and Vale had believed all morning that they were the ones conducting an interview, carefully evaluating a candidate they assumed held no real power. In truth, Bennett's company had been quietly evaluating them the entire time, and not everyone in that building would ultimately measure up. Page was offered a position as a regional hiring manager within Crownwell Systems on the spot, a role with real influence and genuine trust attached to it. Several other junior staff members who had shown quiet integrity throughout the ordeal were invited to interview directly with Crownwell's leadership team in the days ahead. Meanwhile, a number of senior directors who had laughed along when Dorian tore up that resume found themselves quietly removed from consideration entirely, their names crossed off any future involvement with the account. Reginald asked Bennett almost hesitantly whether this was simply an elaborate act of revenge dressed up as corporate strategy. Bennett answered without hesitation, telling him that revenge was tearing something apart a second time simply because it had once been torn. Leadership, he explained, was gathering whatever pieces still held real value and building something stronger from what remained. That distinction mattered enormously to how the story unfolded from that point forward. Bennett held enormous power in that room, more than anyone present had initially realized. Yet he chose to use it to filter out cruelty and protect genuine talent, rather than simply punish an entire company out of spite. It preserved something essential about his character even as the balance of power in the room had shifted entirely in his favor. Before the meeting closed, Bennett asked Page to place the torn fragments of his resume back on the table one final time, not as an act of self-pity, but as a deliberate symbol meant to outlast the conversation itself. Sterling then produced a new document, formally introducing what would become known within Crownwell as the People Standards Initiative, a hiring program specifically designed for capable applicants who had been repeatedly overlooked by larger companies due to shallow, surface-level bias. The very first page of that new program featured a scanned image of Bennett's own torn resume, preserved exactly as it had been left on the marble floor of that lobby. It was not included because Bennett needed anyone's sympathy or validation. It was included so that every recruiter working under the Crownwell name would remember, permanently and unmistakably, that behind every sheet of paper sits a real human being with a real story. Madeline announced that Crownwell would immediately open a new application channel in which every resume containing an employment gap would be evaluated with full context and consideration, rather than being automatically filtered out by rigid, thoughtless criteria. Caregivers, single parents, people who had endured unemployment, and workers who had changed careers entirely would all be given a genuine chance to tell their own story before ever being judged. Dorian absorbed that announcement like a direct blow to whatever pride he had left, yet he no longer held any standing in that room to object or push back. He remained silent near the far wall, watching as Page, the very employee he had once dismissed as insignificant, accepted a formal offer letter from Crownwell Systems in front of the entire leadership team. The final twist of the story carried a quiet, satisfying weight of its own. The resume Dorian had torn apart out of contempt had not simply vanished into the trash where he assumed it belonged. Instead, it became the literal foundation of the very hiring philosophy for the company he had once desperately wanted to serve. Once the meeting concluded, Bennett left the Ashcroft and Vale building without reporters waiting outside, without security trailing behind him, and without anyone applauding his exit. He simply picked up his worn leather bag and walked calmly toward the elevator bank, the same quiet posture he had carried since the moment he first stepped through the front doors the day before. Reginald caught up with him near the elevators, his expression heavier and more subdued than it had been at any point during the meeting, his usual commanding posture replaced by something closer to quiet exhaustion. He admitted, in a low voice meant only for Bennett to hear, that he had spent decades building a firm skilled at pricing human talent for wealthy clients, while somehow forgetting to see the actual worth of the people passing through his own doors. Bennett offered him no comforting words in return, no easy reassurance to soften the moment. He simply told Reginald that a recruiting firm rarely collapses from a shortage of talented candidates walking through its doors. It collapses the moment its leadership starts believing they have the right to look down on the very people they are meant to serve. Paige watched Bennett walk away with something close to genuine reverence in her eyes, finally understanding that her new opportunity had never come from flattering someone powerful or staying quiet to keep the peace. It had come from the simple, unremarkable act of kneeling down to gather a stranger's torn paperwork off a marble floor while everyone else in the room chose to laugh instead. She thought about how easily she could have stayed seated that morning, how tempting it had been to simply look away like everyone around her, and how one small, almost automatic gesture of decency had quietly reshaped the entire direction of her career. Later that evening, a short message arrived on Bennett's phone from his daughter, asking once again whether he would make it home in time. He smiled quietly to himself as he typed back that he would make it, and that he had quite a story to tell her over dinner. That small, warm detail closed the loop on the quieter thread running beneath the entire day, the steady, understated devotion of a father who had built an empire without ever losing sight of the one thing that mattered most to him. Behind the glass wall of the executive conference room, Dorian stood alone for a long moment, watching through the window as Bennett crossed the plaza below and disappeared into the flow of the city. He replayed the morning in his mind, searching for the exact instant everything had slipped out of his control, and found himself circling back again and again to the sound of paper tearing in his own hands, a sound that had felt powerful for exactly as long as it took Bennett to walk back through those doors. His father did not look at him again before leaving the conference room, and the silence between them said more than any lecture could have. For the first time in his life, Dorian began to understand a truth his father's money had never taught him. The most formidable person in any room is rarely the one dressed like a billionaire. It is the one who can quietly own every asset in sight and still remain calm and unshaken while being humiliated in public. Weeks later, word moved quietly through the industry that Ashcroft & Vail had undergone a significant restructuring, with several of its most senior directors departing under circumstances the firm declined to discuss publicly. Paige settled into her new role at Crownwell Systems with a confidence she had never been allowed to show in her old position, building a hiring process that judged candidates by their actual ability rather than the assumptions people made about them at first glance. She kept one small, worn fragment of Bennett's original resume pinned above her desk, not as a trophy, but as a daily reminder of exactly the kind of recruiter she intended to become. Under her guidance, the new intake process asked interviewers to explain any employment gap in writing before ever meeting a candidate in person, forcing a moment of context before judgment could take hold. Bennett, for his part, returned to the quiet rhythm of his life almost as if the entire confrontation had never happened, arriving home most evenings in time to help his daughter with homework spread across the same kitchen table where Crownwell Systems had first taken shape years earlier. He rarely spoke about the meeting to anyone outside the company, and when reporters eventually caught wind of the story and requested interviews, he declined every single one, preferring that the new hiring program speak for itself rather than his own name attached to a headline. That day, Ashcroft & Vail did not simply lose a lucrative contract they had spent months chasing. They lost the right to judge people they had never actually taken the time to see.